Hello, everybody. I've got an interesting interview, I hope, today with a woman who's a rural consultant. Her name is Mary O'Brien. Um, and I first heard about her when she wrote a very important article about male suicide. Hello, Mary.
Hello, Bettina. How are you?
Really good. You should explain to us, you're an expert on spray application technology, which is something I know nothing about. You want to tell us what that's all about?
So that is pretty much to do with farming and spray application of pesticides throughout Australia. And so I go around Australia talking to mostly men in their sheds and on their farms and in large groups about the best practice ways to apply pesticides and how to do a really good job and safely.
Yep. And you live in central Queensland on the Darling Downs.
Yes, southern Queensland, Darling Downs.
Southern, yeah, okay. So, as you say, you live in a very blokey world, and you wrote this article, like a couple of years ago now, isn't it? Called "Are You Bogged, Mate?" Tell me about that and why you wrote it.
So I wrote it about 18 months ago, and it was a couple of months before that we'd had 2 suicides in very quick succession on the Darling Downs in my region, and they were sort of within a few weeks of each other. And the ripple effect that was felt by the community and the people left behind was just huge, really heartbreaking to see the community, and particularly it was just before Christmas and over the Christmas period. So it was a really tough time for families to be dealing with something like that. And I guess I had a lot to do with a lot of the fellows who were coming to terms with this and trying to understand it. So I started to question my skills in this area, and having no skills in this area, certainly not a doctor or a psychologist at all. But how could I possibly help these men in particular who were left behind, who were really struggling with the loss of their mates? And I was just trying to research to find out how I could improve my skills, particularly when these men were confiding in me and talking to me about the death of their mates. And, how could I identify someone who was in that sort of headspace or needed that help? And that's what led to the article, was really my frustration in my own lack of skills in this area.
I mean, I think one of the things that made it so your article so striking, Mary, is you're very straightforward, and you point out that a lot of the talk around suicide doesn't resonate with you. You say, how the experts keep talking about that it's all about men not talking about their feelings. They don't know how to express their feelings. And you said that was bullshit, and that countrymen. Tell me about what you think about all of that.
Well, I think the problem is that a lot of the counselling and the information is probably more centred on women and how women deal with things and how women heal. And, men are a completely different beast to women, so they deal with things differently. And I think particularly with the rural men, and certainly that's my, area where I've spent a lot of time working with rural men, that they deal with things quite differently. And I guess I just wanted them to know that they didn't need to sit down with a box of tissues and wear a pink shirt to express their emotions or their feelings. And I think that's what really struck me about a lot of the research and information, was that they had sort of missed the target with that demographic, that they didn't really understand how they worked. And they do express emotions and feelings, but it's just not in the textbook way that they're expected to, I guess.
Yep. But the other thing you talked about are the factors leading to depression and to suicide, and that everybody, of course, in rural areas talks about the drought and enormous pressures on men maintaining a business in these, in what's a very tough environment now. But people will talk about that, but they won't talk about some of the other issues which you talk about very briefly in your article, such as the relationship issues, shared parenting, breakup of relationships, marriage breakdown, so on. And that's, I suppose, where my ears pricked up, that you were addressing the elephant in the room, the thing that no one wants to talk about, which is the reason a lot of men are committing suicide. And for a significant proportion of men, it's got to do with the way women are behaving.
And I think when we look at some of the statistics and the information from coronial reports, we're seeing that there's other factors at play. And I think particularly for country men, that isolation, and when we start seeing a relationship breakdown, they've often worked for many years as a team together, and so that relationship breakdown really does leave them quite isolated. They can be many, many miles and sometimes 2 days drive from their children. So those sorts of things, the family dynamics, just even the relationships within the family, succession planning, if they don't want to stay on the farm, all these sorts of things come into play to impact on top of the drought and the floods and the fires and all of these other natural things that they are fairly well adapted to dealing with.
Yep. But I can't tell you how many men I've talked to over the years who've lost their family farm through divorce, and what a tragedy that is. Something that's been part of their family for generations, and it could just go because of a divorce settlement. I mean, incredible stress on men, and other issues that are often talked about, such as financial stress, which of course applies, is an extraordinary problem for men facing the drought now. But when they're dealing with the financial consequences of a divorce on top of that, it's just unbearable strain, isn't it?
And the other thing with the drought, if they're feeding stock or things like that, they can't really go away for 3 or 4 days to visit their children, and that makes it harder again. They're not having that relationship with their children because they're really tied to that farm during a drought period. Yep.
Now, what interests me, okay, here you are, a rural consultant, you welcome everywhere, welcome by a lot of the women in agriculture groups who think you're wonderful, which is fantastic. But you've now written an article which at its heart has a controversial message about us getting male suicide wrong. What's it been like for you when you're in conferences and things, beginning to talk about some of that? How do the women react?
Look, I think most of the rural women are very supportive of it, that they are concerned about the men out there, and I've had some really positive feedback from women in the rural sector. I've also had some negative feedback saying that, these men are going back to the textbooks, like they're not doing this or they're not doing that and we need to change them. And also there's an expectation, I guess it's just a difference between the sexes, that women expect the men to sit down and talk about it and open up and things like that, whereas I tend to think that the women will talk it out to work out a problem, whereas the rural men in particular will think it out before they, to work it out. So there is still that little bit of expectation there. But look, generally most of the women are very supportive. I guess I'm seeing a lot of men, and I'm hearing a lot of men, they're talking to me about the issues of relationship breakdowns that are causing those strains, and particularly around child custody or access to children. And again, that financial stress on top of the drought, those sort of things are really coming into play, particularly after extended drought that we've been seeing in many areas of Australia.
Yeah, look, I'm so delighted that you're out there talking about this. And I'm not surprised you get a lot of support from ordinary women, because women know, they watch their brothers, they watch their friends, they see this. And women know that that there is a group of women who are really letting down men very badly. And they see they write to me all the time. They see the consequences of this. But what's interesting is the fact that this has become such a no-no to discuss. And I was in a chemist yesterday, one of our big chemist warehouse, our big chains, and there I was delighted to see they were raising money for men's health, and they'd partnered with this organisation called Gotcha for Life, and that's a suicide program which was set up by Gus Warland, who's a radio presenter, well-known radio presenter in Australia. Now, what was interesting to me when I discovered all of this is Gus Warland made a program for the ABC a few years ago on male suicide. I was very excited about it. It was called Man Up. It's a lavish program. They travelled all over Australia, even I think overseas, for this program, showing the problems of male suicide. And the whole thing copped out in the end, because although it ended up a program about teaching men to cry, teaching men to show their feelings. It said nothing at all about the real causes of male suicide, and it was the most dreadful cop-out. And and so I was really disappointed to see this good initiative from Chemist Warehouse to raise money for men's health, and this money is going essentially to an organisation. Apparently they're doing some good work and they're giving more money for telephone counselling, which is good, but most of what they're doing is the stuff in schools teaching boys to cry and teaching boys to reach out for. Now, you make that point in your article that men, I mean, that's the "are you being bogged" issue, isn't it? That you say if a tractor gets bogged, you can't get it out yourself, you have to reach out for help. But I mean, the notion that this is what we have to do, we have to teach men to behave differently and we'll solve the problem is such a cop-out to me. Anyway, tell me what you think about all that.
Yeah, look, I think that was, I guess the point of that article was that wouldn't it be easier to change the way we communicate with them and deal with the issue rather than try and change them? So we've got this whole population of men out there, and all of the information that I was reading was indicating that we needed to change them, whereas surely changing the way we communicate this information and certainly our expectations of what men need would be more beneficial.
Yeah. And the fact that our national suicide strategy, we had a draft national suicide prevention strategy released, which involves both state and federal governments, and it was gender neutral. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. This huge government strategy is pretending there's no difference between male and female suicide, and is deliberately playing down the fact that this is a male problem. And I think that is totally outrageous that that's happening. And that, you've talked to me about, I want to go through with you, Mary, some of the key facts about suicide in Australia and the fact that this is glaringly an overwhelming male problem now. So I'm going to show you. So here, if we look at this graph here now, you've got 6 out of 8 suicides in Australia every day. Six of the 8 daily suicides are male. We've had a big leap in male suicides in the last period, up nearly 10% in male suicides, which no one is talking about. And one of the things you mentioned to me was the fact that this idea that it's all linked to mental health is totally wrong. I mean, you mentioned some research on male farmer suicides. Tell me about that.
So I think some of the latest research is showing that 78% of male farmer suicides are not linked to a mental health diagnosis. So there's a couple of things that we can glean from that, and either they're not seeking help or being diagnosed. And I think that is certainly a big problem in rural areas. They're not going and getting that help and getting diagnosed. But I think the other thing that this research points out is that we really need to consider the other factors that are causing these problems or causing the suicide rates or leading to suicide. So what are the other factors in their life? So life events. And so looking beyond that mental illness, we can't just say that every person who suicides has a mental illness. But I think there's a lack of diagnosis, but there's also a lot of other things going on. And I'm certainly seeing it and I'm hearing it, the emails, the messages I get from men in country Australia that are telling me what's going on in their world. It's showing that there's a whole bunch of other things going on out there that are impacting on them.
Yeah, we've got some of that. We've got some quite good research on this, which never usually sees the light of day. I mean, this is exactly the sort of stuff that gets no mention whatsoever in the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. So here we've got causes of male suicide. And if you look at this, I mean, half of male suicides are linked to relationship issues. We've got, 1 in 20 linked to child custody, but even things like legal matters, 1 in 10 are linked to pending legal matters. As you know, Mary, I mean, a lot of that, it's all part of the same story. You've got a relationship breakup, you end up with money issues, you end up involved in legal matters, and the whole thing. So a lot of these factors we're looking at here are intertwined. That's what you're hearing from a lot of men, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And the data from those coronial reports are saying is that Some of those main factors are bereavement, which is not necessarily a death, it's loss. And so particularly if they've lost their family, lost their partner, things like that, relationship issues, child custody, legal issues and money issues. And whether we see them as standalone things, they're quite often, and certainly in the majority of stories I'm hearing, those things are all fairly intertwined and, resulting from, relationship breakdown or be that with their partner, wife or whatever, or within the family. So those things, certainly all linked together in some way, I think, or can be.
And if you see this, we've got another graph here comparing male and female suicide. And that's the point in regard to the prevention strategy. The causes of male suicide are very different from the causes of female suicide in many cases. You look here, they're twice as 3.5 times more likely to link to relationship issues, 4 times more likely to be linked to child custody issues, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got this difference, which is absolutely deliberately not being addressed. They're doing no further research on a government level into what's going on here, why there's so many men struggling to deal with relationships issues and committing suicide. They don't want to know. And that their whole strategy is designed to have programs that appeal just as much to women as men and nothing that actually specifically tailored to the problems of men.
I guess there is that issue, but is it because the men are not... I find that men are not really willing to speak up and say what the real issues are for fear of being targeted. And, so the men are just sort of sitting back quietly. They know what the problem is, or a lot of the problems to them, but they can't just come out and say it because it sounds sexist and all of these sorts of things. So a lot of those things that the men are just staying quiet about it. So I guess these, the national programs and things maybe aren't identifying just how serious this is out there on the ground.
Yeah, and the guys you're talking to, they're dealing with some of the aspects of divorce that are particularly difficult, like false AVOs, where accusations of violence are made. If a man goes into a counsellor and says, well, that's the reason I'm feeling suicidal, I don't think he's going to get much of a good hearing, is he?
Well, I guess it's a double-edged sword, because if they actually go and get counselling and get a mental health program in place, then their partner can come back and say, well, you're not fit to look after the children, so they lose further access to children. So it sort of compounds the problem. But I guess the DVOs that are out there at the moment, it just seems to be the new black that. When there's a separation, they put a DVO out there, and by no means do I ever want to, discredit the value of a DVO for genuine cases, because I think that's actually what's happening, that everyone gets a DVO against them now. It's extremely difficult and extremely expensive for them to fight or, to refute those claims. But with the number that are out there that are absolutely false, in my circle of friends that I see, I think it's really devaluing how important a DVO is for genuine victims of violence and sexual abuse. So I think that, that's what really upsets me, that the people who genuinely need this, it's being devalued. So that those sort of false DVOs, which comes with a lot of other impacts for rural men, again, that access to children. But, a lot of these men have firearms licences and that for the farms and things like that, or recreation, and those rights are removed from them if there's a DVO against them, obviously.
Yep.
So it's compounding thing. Small communities, the perception, if you've got a DVO against you, that, the whole community's like, what? We didn't know he was violent. But then there's no actual proof. And so those false DVOs are a huge concern to me.
Yeah, I remember, I used to do this online dating coaching, and I can't tell you how many times I'd hear, be helping a woman, and she'd say, oh, I heard this guy, she's just met a guy, and then she'd say, I heard he had a AVO, DVO, violence order against him, and I'm not going to have anything to do with him. I mean, that sort of reputation
Yeah.
That damage to his reputation never leaves a man. I mean, it
No.
can just happen, particularly in a small community, as you say.
Yeah, and I'm seeing like really good, genuine men who are not violent, would never be violent. And that sort of accusation absolutely just breaks their soul.
Yeah.
It's really heartbreaking to see the impact of this on some of these men. And again, it's expensive to fight, so they just sort of, just go with it and wait till it expires or whatever happens. It's really heartbreaking.
I mean, all of this must be just so much harder in these isolated communities where, as you say, they have to drive for miles to get to the nearest town, whatever. Tell me about that. I mean, fighting a family law case in rural areas must be particularly difficult.
And particularly with child custody issues, if they have to, or access issues rather than custody, but if they, the court grants them access, they drive, 14, 15 hours to visit their children, they get there and then they're denied access, they're not allowed to see them. Yeah. And if they go to the house or whatever to collect the children, then they're often slapped for the DVO. When they've just driven, miles to visit their children. So, what do? Do they turn around and go home, or do they? It's just, the distances are certainly making it harder. Again, they've got all those hours in the car by themselves with their own thoughts. They've got no one to talk to. Many areas, the coverage for, phones and so on is not good. So it's not like they can get on the phone for that drive home and complain to their mates or their mum or whomever. It is quite isolating, and the distance doesn't help.
No. And of course, one of the issues that is very rarely addressed is the fact that there are a lot of suicides which are never even counted as suicide because, the car goes off the road, the car goes into the tree. I mean, you must see that all the time.
Yeah, and particularly even when I was growing up as a child in the bush, you'd hear about it's a shooting accident.
Yeah.
Sure, there are shooting accidents, but how many of those were reported as an accident and they weren't? I've had men say, it would be just as easy for me to get through look like I was getting through the fence with the gun. And that's just tragic, absolutely tragic.
Yeah, so terrible. Interesting, Mary. I was looking at another research project released just recently from Beyondblue, one of the organisations targeting depression, and in good research looking at ambulance call-outs to men, and they found that 3 times higher than the current estimates indicate this sort of, this at-risk behaviour is 3 times higher than what people thought. So there 20,000 ambulance attendants for men who had attempted suicide or had suicidal thoughts this was 2015 to 2016. And the existing data from prior to that from hospital emergency presentations would indicate only 10,000. So we've got 3 times as many men on the basis of this ambulance information at risk or, attempting suicide, which, I'm very good to see Beyondblue doing some work on this because I think they've been pretty shocking on a whole range of men's issues. But finally, they're addressing an important issue here, which is these buried statistics of men who are just not being counted as at risk in our society.
Yeah, that's really interesting that data was never sort of considered before. And I think that's probably very critical data to acknowledge and to get our heads around. That that's a huge difference.
One of the things that's really outraged me, I've been fighting about this issue for decades, is, when we have a known cause of female suicide or female depression, like postpartum depression, when that first started to be talked about, we poured resources into helping mums who just had babies, find their way through that. Now we have this evidence that this is a trigger point. This is a time in men's lives when they're particularly vulnerable, and we are deliberately not giving any resources to that problem. I mean, there's organisations like Dads in Distress, which has done fantastic work for years around Australia, and they face a constant struggle in money. They have for years in their money being cut back, particularly. Labor governments are very unsympathetic. to anything involving men. I think they've done a bit better recently, but the fact that we won't, a man going through all the things you were talking about, Mary, where he's lost his kids and he drives halfway across the country to see his kids and then he's denied contact, all that stuff, he's going to act out. He's either going to kill himself or he's going to be dangerous to someone else. I mean, a lot of men are very vulnerable there. These are sort of powder keg men, and we are doing nothing to support them. We're doing nothing to help them, and it's a very deliberate, ideologically driven political strategy to pretend this isn't happening. I mean, I don't know what resources you have in your communities for, helping men who are going through divorce. Do you think there are any?
I honestly don't even know. I think there's plenty of counselling and there are services out there. The catch is that these men are not accessing it or don't want to access it because, again, it's usually female orientated. I'm hearing the things saying, if I go to the counsellor, she's a woman. And it's not that they have anything against women, but they just want to talk to a bloke. So I think we've got a drastic shortage of male, friendly services available. I honestly don't know what the answer is. So we've got a few problems there. I think one is they're reluctant to reach out. When they reach out, they're fairly let down. Other things that would make some changes in this area would be in the family law system, those sorts of systems that are really adding to these problems for men. So if he drives, 14 hours to see his children and is denied access, there's no repercussions for the parent who's withholding that. And so they're the sort of reforms that will ease these things as well as providing services as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach. There's no silver bullet that's going to fix all this. But I think in an effort to make things safer for children and women, in particular in relation to divorce settlement and children, it's actually made it worse for them. And they're at the point where they don't have a right of reply, I guess.
Well, Mary, it's been lovely talking to you today, and I'm really pleased you're out there addressing some of these important issues around male suicide, particularly in rural areas. And I hope you'll keep in touch and tell us about the work you're doing in this area.
Thank you, Bettina. Really appreciate the chat, and I will continue to do so. I might ruffle a few feathers, but I'm used to ruffling feathers with in the spray application world. So when I'm just talking about the truth and what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing directly from men, they're the ones that are, the rates speak for themselves, and we need to address that somehow.
We do. Thanks very much, Mary. Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.